All right, hello everybody. Today I've got a review of The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells from you. This is the 1896 novel. Novel is a little bit of a strong word. This is a pretty short book. I've never read it before, but I was going through some amazing stories, the Pulp magazine, and I saw that it was there in 2 parts, so I figured I'd give it a look, among other things. There's also a 1996 film that I've never seen, but I've heard a little bit about, so I had kind of a vague idea of what I might be getting into, but not really a strong idea of what I was getting into. So this is, mostly a well, I wouldn't say it was a surprise, but at the same time, like the extent of what goes on in this book was a little bit wow. You know what I mean? Kind of overwhelming, even a little bit at times. This is a classic of science fiction with kind of a bit of a like a biological science fiction, I guess, right? It's dark, it's grotesque, it's stomach-turning. It's not a particularly happy story. It's a shipwreck story, which there were a lot of shipwreck stories back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where, a character gets shipwrecked, and then, you get a book based on his adventures over the time he was shipwrecked. So this book is written from the point of view of an English natural historian named Edward Prendick, who was missing for a year after a shipwreck on a boat that he was on, and then was picked up by another boat a year later, and basically he said that, oh yeah, I don't have any memory of what happened in that year, but then it turns out that after he died, his son, nephew, finds a manuscript, which is the story that we're getting. So, from a literary perspective, this is an important story. It's very important bit of science fiction. It's pretty classic. It's classic H.G. Wells. It's a solid mix of action with a lot of tension and mystery. It has a good pace. There's never too long of a period where there's not some kind of major shift. At the same time, it's a little bit of a slow burn here and there. Simple, effective characters. It's a pretty good story. It's well written. The descriptions are don't read this while you're trying to eat a meal. There's some interesting philosophical ideas and so on. I really can't say much about the plot without spoilers, so this is going to be a short non-spoiler section. Bottom line of the non-spoiler section, it's if you're interested in classic science fiction, you probably should read it. What I said about the pacing and stuff and descriptions is all what I think, but I can't say much about the plot, even in kind of a brief synopsis that wouldn't spoil significant chunks of the story. So let's move on to the spoiler section. Spoiler section. This is a shipwreck story, right? But it's almost like a double shipwreck story because technically there are two shipwrecks. Prendick is saved from his first shipwreck. He's on a dinghy with two other people, and those two other people are kind of getting to the point where they're going to draw straws and figure out who to eat first. And they get into a fight and they fall off the dinghy. They sink like stones, and Prendick is the only one left alone on this boat. He gets picked up by another ship, and we get a couple of chapters where he's just kind of on this ship, and there's some weird stuff going on the ship, right? The captain is drunk. The ship is called the Vein something, but the captain calls it the Ipecacuah, which Ipecac syrup is like a vomit-inducing syrup. So I guess he's making a joke about seasickness or something. But basically, the main character kind of gets a little bit of his strength back. He meets this character named Montgomery, who is going to this island that the ship is going to, and the captain is drunk and very combative. And when they arrive at the island, Prendick believes that he's going to stay on the boat and they're going to take him back to some port, in civilization, and he's going to go home. But in fact, he gets thrown off the boat, and they basically drag him onto the island of Dr. Moreau. We have Montgomery, we have Montgomery's manservant, and then we have a cargo of some animals, a puma, some staghounds, and a few hutches of rabbits. So kind of weird stuff, right? I'm going onto this tiny volcanic island where there's not really much for a puma or staghounds to eat, and not a place where boats come and go all the time, and there's like a thriving market of food for these animals, and a little creepy and a little weird. So the first impression of Charles Edward Prendick is the nephew. So he's mentioned at the very start of of the book, but Edward Prendick. Edward Prendick gets the first impression that Dr. Moreau is doing vivisections of animals. He's a physiologist, I believe is what they call it, and he's doing surgeries to kind of determine how the animals work and stuff like that, right? So he's basically, it seems like he's torturing this poor puma to death. And it's very, it's very vivid in the story, and it's not very comfortable to read, honestly. And, this is unsavory work, but also, as a natural historian, Prendick is like, well, this is kind of how we need to study things sometimes. It sucks, but that's kind of the way it goes. But over the next day or two, Prendick gets this impression that it's not just animals that Moreau is killing. He starts to believe that it's actually people, and that he's going to be the next victim. It's worth noting that Prendick remembers Moreau, who used to work as a biologist somewhere in England, and he basically got thrown out of polite scientific society because of his brashness and his desire to do strange things as experiments. So he's getting this worse and worse impression of Moreau, and finally it comes to a head, and he thinks, they're going to kill me, and then that's that, right? So he runs off. He runs off into the forest on this island, and what he finds is something very strange. It is like this village of men who all have very strange countenances. They have very short legs. They have kind of animalistic faces, and yet at the same time they seem fairly docile. They're fairly civilized. They have these laws that they recite over and over again about, like, don't taste blood, don't claw trees, don't do this, don't do that. And they're all kind of like civilizing influences, or at least they appear to be. And so, he stays there for a little while. He eats some fruit because they're all supposed to be vegetarians. And then, after a little while, he discovers that Montgomery and Moreau are after him. So a chase ensues. We get a nice action scene where Prendick is running around the island, and Montgomery and Moreau are chasing him with whips and revolvers, and like Prendick goes out into the ocean, into the water, and is about to drown himself when Moreau and Montgomery are like, stop, don't, what are you doing, you nut job, what are you freaking doing? And, they manage to kind of convince him that they're not going to kill him. They basically leave the revolvers on the beach, and they walk away from them, and they let him pick up the two revolvers, and they're like, you can keep them, we don't need them, it's probably going to be fine. So kind of, they at least try to disarm any sense that he's in immediate danger. And so Prendick basically decides to trust them tentatively. And then we get a chapter where Moreau explains exactly what he's doing. It's not that he's doing vivisections of animals, and it's definitely not that he's doing vivisections of people. He's doing these series of very intensive, like, surgeries and grafts on animals, where he'll take one animal's part and sew it onto another animal, and he'll mess with their legs and arms and bodies and heads and everything. And his goal is to kind of turn animals into these humanoids with a semblance of intelligence that Prendick saw that village of. So, this is all creepy and pretty stomach-churning at times. But then we also get something from Moreau which is very kind of eerie or scary, or whatever you want to call it. Moreau basically says, so Prendick asks about, like, causing pain, and Moreau's answer is like, pain is literally nothing. It is irrelevant. Any improvements that I cause to these animals that makes them more civilized in the long run is worth whatever pain it takes to get there. And so, this is not a very sympathetic man, right? At the same time, he's not entirely a monster. He's not a Dr. Frankenstein exactly, but he's getting close. He's very detached from, from the feelings of anything around him. One thing that's interesting about this book is that it was, like I said, it was written in 1896, and Moreau actually mentions the possibility of offspring among the beastmen, and it's funny because I just looked this up. But so Gregor Mendel did his work on heredity in the 1860s. However, it turns out that he published that work in an obscure German scientific journal, and so it never actually received the attention that it eventually would get. In fact, the rediscovery of the Mendelian work happened in and around 1900 and beyond. So this book was written in a very narrow period of time where someone knew how genetics worked, kind of, sort of, but like the average Englishman did not. It was not something that had made its way into kind of like the general understanding of the English-speaking countries. So, like, if Wells had written this 10 years later, right? If Wells had written this 10 years later, he would have had the advantage of knowing how Mendelian inheritance works, and he might not have made this kind of Lysenkoist description of how the Beastman's offspring work, but, I can forgive it. He literally almost, unless he was an avid reader of obscure German biology journals, which he was not, I can't really blame him. So Moreau says that the problem with the work that he's doing is that these beastmen that he's creating are constantly kind of reverting back to their animal natures, back into instinct. And so he not only messes with their bodies, but he messes with their minds. He calls it hypnotism, where he's like, yeah, I imprint these laws into their minds so that they stay civilized. And that's why they're so kind of cultishly aware of these laws and the danger of violating them. And the laws, according to Moreau, keep these animals relatively civilized. So the problem is that they brought rabbits to the island in order to feed Moreau and Montgomery. But the problem is that the rabbits are all over the island, and so some of the animals who are less, let's say, tied to the laws that Moreau has put down start killing the rabbits. And this taste of blood that some of these animals get has a strong decivilizing effect on them, basically. It ruins Moreau's influence, it ruins Moreau's hypnotism over them, and they become unruly, a few at a time, basically. The puma that Moreau is working on, his greatest work so far, he says, escapes, and Moreau basically runs after it, and later on they find Moreau dead. And after that, things basically spiral. Montgomery and Prendick are working together for a little while, but it's not very long before Montgomery himself is killed by one of the beastmen. Prendick is left practically alone. There's a humanized Saint Bernard that kind of serves as his protector for a little while, but eventually even that dies. And all the while, Prendick is observing the slow deterioration of these animals. It wasn't just the laws; it was the enforcement of the laws that, and the presence of Moreau and Montgomery that kept them where they needed to be. And the fear of the House of Pain is what they called Moreau's laboratory, right? And that was the stuff that was really keeping them from deteriorating. So over the course of the next several months, the main character Prendick is kind of alone on the island. The animal people are becoming more and more like animals. One of them in particular, is trying to hunt him. He has to deal with that. At the same time, he tries to work on building a raft, and he's a natural historian. He doesn't know how to build a raft, so that doesn't go well either. But he eventually finds a ship and manages to escape, and then we get to the point where he's like, yeah, I was never the same again, basically. I could never view my fellow man in the same way, thinking that, basically their civilizedness was only a hair's breadth away kind of thing. Kind of usual ending for this kind of story. Not particularly exciting ending or anything like that. But there is some cool stuff about the boat that he finds and stuff like that. So decent, right? So of course, there's a lot of really weird philosophical ideas in this. There's some incorrect ideas about how heredity works. There's some outdated ideas about how, intelligent animals are and how pliable, skin grafts and flesh grafts of various types are. Things like that. It's creepy and it's unsettling in a lot of places. It's gross and it's imaginative, and it is just a pretty terrifying read, honestly. So, with that said, let's finish up the spoiler section and head into the conclusions. All right, conclusions. This is a solidly written, very unsettling story. It has its main draw is the detail and the horrifyingness of the situation, and H.G. Wells' descriptions of things, as well as the philosophical and kind of biological aspects of the story that I mentioned in the spoiler section. Moreau as a character is not really sympathetic, but there is a minor effort made to make him seem more reasonable, not a monster, But generally speaking, we have relatively simple characters. There are the number of main characters in this book is 3. There's a couple of extra side characters here and there. And the plot is straightforward for the most part. There's a couple of twists here and there, but nothing too out of the ordinary, at least in the world of the book that we're talking about. The characters react plausibly to all the stuff that happens, and the advancement of the story seems pretty reasonable. The pacing is solid with, occasional things to jump the tension up. It's a little bit slow at times, but not in like a boring way. I never felt bored reading the story, and it's a short one too, so you won't be bored. You might feel a little ill, but you won't be bored. It raises some kind of semi-interesting philosophical questions about Moreau's idea, and if they were possible, would it be worth it to do it, right? Like, if you read the story, you'll know what I mean. And of course, this was written in a very short period of time where the Mendelian advances in our understanding of hereditary biology had been written, but were largely unknown and relegated to an obscure German scientific journal that wasn't rediscovered until early 1900s. So the version of this that I read was a 2-part pulp in Amazing Stories, Volume 1, numbers 7 and 8, I believe. And I found a novel, like a book version of it as well, at least a scan of a book. And it seems plausible that the pulp version is unabridged. It's not a very long book, and it's worth a read. If you're interested in classic science fiction, if you're interested in H.G. Wells and you haven't read enough of his works and you want to read one of his classics, this is one of them. And it's a good read as long as you're not reading it right immediately before or immediately after a meal. So yeah, The Island of Dr. Moreau, a 1896 classic by H.G. Wells. Excellent book. Excellence may be a little strong, but very good book. Very classic book. Very creepy book. I mean, it would have been just as at home in Weird Tales as it was in Amazing Stories. And a classic shipwreck story with solid plot, few simple characters but effective characters, a few interesting philosophical questions, and a good read overall. So yeah, that's what I've got for you this time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I will have links in the description as to where you can read this book. And have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you next time.